Welcome back to the second day of the second Measuring Progress workshop. Today we're going to continue, you can see here, with Koen Decanq, who is going to critically assess self-reported measures of well-being and potentially provide an alternative. And this is how I became aware of his work on measuring progress from a more, I would say, theoretical point of view, but applying it in Belgium as well as elsewhere. So it's also important, I think, to think about these presentations on measurement more broadly as what we need to go forward from the policy maker point of view. We need to develop the rigor and precision, I think, necessary to win their hearts and minds. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Koen. So I think some of you are already quite familiar with his work. But those of you who are not, he's a professor at the Center for Social Policy at the University of Antwerp. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Leuven. Currently, he is a fellow at the Department of Economics of the University of Leuven and at the Center for Philosophy of Natural and Social Sciences at the London School of Economics. His research interests, you heard a little bit yesterday, are in large parts inequality, but also welfare economics, measurement of multidimensional factors, including inequality, poverty, and well-being, with a special focus on the incorporation of individual preferences and the role of social, aging, and well-being policies. He's an associate editor of Social Choice and Welfare, also at the Journal of Economic Inequality, and a member of the editorial board of the Review of Income and Wealth. He's a country team leader for Flanders, with a survey of health, aging, retirement, and retirement in Europe. And we haven't talked about share much in this conference thus far, but I think it's worth looking at in much more detail. Also, I can report back that he's a good person to share a conference dinner table with. So without further ado, Koen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kelsey. I also remember that evening. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I really enjoyed yesterday, and I'm very much looking forward to today. So thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about well-being comparisons, interpersonal and intrapersonal well-being comparisons, and what the potential role that I see for self-reported well-being data in that. Okay, let me immediately reveal that I come from a neighboring field, as Tessa was introducing herself as well yesterday. I come from welfare economics, and I look at, let's say, the self-reported well-being group from that perspective. And what I will be saying is to be interpreted from that perspective. I'm going to talk about work. I mean, all the errors are mine, but I'm going to talk about work that I have been doing in the past with Erik Schokkaert from the University of Leuven and Marc Fleurbet from the Paris School of Economics. Now, we have done quite some work on that. And then I have also had the pleasure, I was very happy to work with excellent doctoral students on this topic with Santi, Matteo, and Annemie. And I'm going to talk about their work later, and I'm going to introduce what we have done together. Matteo will be on the job market, just for you to know. So I have to stand still, I have learned. So I think what is important in a multidisciplinary workshop like this, when we talk about well-being, I think it's very important to be very clear and precise about what notion of well-being that you're using and what purpose that notion should serve for you. So again, as I am a welfare economist, my aim or my objective is to give advice to policymakers to evaluate policies, to think about the design of policies, to think about what are monitoring tools that we have to track the progress that policy is making. So that's my perspective, right? And if you want to do that, very soon you run into the problem, or you have the challenge that you want to make well-being comparisons, that you want to say something like, well, you are better off than I am. I think that's one of the key challenges. For instance, imagine that you are a policymaker, you have scarce resources, and you want to give that to the worse off in some kind of a Rawlsian background in mind. Well, then of course you need a tool to say who is worse off. or I've already revealed my background in inequality analysis. What is an inequality measure? An inequality measure is a measure that is sensitive to a Pigou-Dalton transfer. What's a Pigou-Dalton transfer? You take some resources from somebody who's better off, you give those to somebody who's worse off, and then you say inequality goes down. Now, that requires, again, a tool that tells you that person is better off and that person is worse off. So I think that if also talking about measuring social progress, very often when you want to do policy evaluation, design, monitoring, you need a tool to make interpersonal well-being comparisons. And the well-being for me is the metric that we use to make those interpersonal well-being comparisons. So I have a very instrumental view on well-being. Well-being is really an instrument for policy making, okay? Which might be very different from some of you who say, no, Koen, that's not well-being for me. So that's why I want to be clear from the start what well-being is from my perspective. Second starting point is, and I can refer to the Stiglitz, who has not made a PowerPoint or a presentation starting from the Stiglitz report. Is always nice to quote a Nobel Prize winner on your first bullet point. The Stiglitz report, one of the arguments they made was well-being is multidimensional. And I want to acknowledge at least the possibility that well-being is multidimensional. You see immediately that if well-being is multidimensional, the comparisons are much harder. You might be better off in one dimension, I might be better off in another one. Now, who is overall better off? That's the key challenge. How do we proceed? Typically, we say, well, we need a measure to aggregate across the different dimensions. Within such a measure, there is a view on the relative importance of the different dimensions. You have to say how much of an improvement in one dimension can compensate for a worsening in another dimension. And that is very fundamental, because you're saying something about the relative importance of the dimensions of well-being that is very close to having a particular view on the good life. So I think that that is very fundamental. And the third starting point is that I want to acknowledge, again, not impose, but I want to allow for the possibility that people have different views on that. That you and me might disagree on what is the good life. We all perhaps go home this weekend to vote. And I'm afraid that on Sunday evening, we will realize that we do not have the same view on the good life than some of our compatriots. And I think that these three ingredients, that forms the cocktail, if you want, the cocktail of a research agenda, and that is more or less my research agenda. So how can we make interpersonal comparisons in a multidimensional setting where people might have potentially different preferences? The question for today, and that's what I want to do in, let's say, 40 minutes, is to reflect with you what's the role of self-reported well-being data in that research agenda. Before proceeding, so this view on the good life, I will refer to that, revealing my upbringing as a microeconomist, as a preference relation. That's the preferences of a person. So the preferences of a person, I mean, I'll talk about revealed preferences later if you want, but the preferences of a person is just a view on the good life. So I'm going to often use these graphs in which I represent life situations here in 2 dimensions, because their static is rich, but they don't have 3-dimensional glasses to hand out yet. That's for next conference, right? So there is 2 dimensions. Let's call them income and health, a non-monetary aspect to focus ideas and to connect with the presentation of Tessa yesterday. We can call that health. And so each dot is a life situation. This is a person, and this is an indifference curve of that person that reflects all the points that are equally good according to her. Points above are better, points below are worse. So that captures the view of the good life of that blue person. My presentation, from a philosophical point of view, can be seen as a preferentialist presentation. I'm a preferentialist, meaning that, that's what I think I have revealed on my first and my second bullet. If we want to say something about well-being, that as a preferentialist, I think that that should be consistent with the preferences of people. So a well-being, my measure of well-being, again, to be used in policymaking, should for me be consistent with individual preferences. That is to avoid that we are acting as paternalists, that we are saying, well, we do well-being enhancing policies, and in the end, we spend money to bring people to situations that they do not prefer. Okay, if you want to avoid that, That is my position, or the position for this presentation today, and that's what I will refer to as preferentialism. So as a preferentialist, what's the use of self-reported well-being data? That's my question. This is very dangerous because this is more your field than my field, right? So self-reported well-being, when I talk about self-reported well-being, I'm going to mainly refer to a question like this. We have learned about the wording of the question yesterday in all details. That's how the question was worded in this in the survey that we have done that is underlying this book. That's a survey I'm going to refer to often to data from that survey. That's the so-called Make-In survey. Very horrible acronym, I know, but that's the survey that we have done in 2016. Think of it as 3,400 respondents in 2,000 households that we have asked many things about well-being. And this is a distribution, for instance, of this life satisfaction question, which is very standard, looks very much as what we would expect for Belgium. So my question again for my presentation, and I want to talk about two main roles that self-reported well-being can play in this preferentialist research agenda. First one would be to say, well, Koen, yes, I'm a preferentialist. And that's exactly why I'm sitting here. I'm a preferentialist, and that's why I use self-reported well-being data. That's what I'm going to talk first about. And then second, I'm going to talk about the more indirect use, but I'll come to that halfway, more or less. Okay? So that's what I've said. So the first perspective would be, I'm a preferentialist, I want to respect preferences, and that's exactly why I use self-reported well-being data. So then the question that immediately is on the table, that's in fact the implicit question is, okay, but these comparisons of self-reported well-being, are they actually consistent with the preferences of people? And to study that, I think it's useful to make a distinction between intrapersonal comparisons and interpersonal comparisons. And we have learned from the work of Mark, who is sitting here on the first row, so I have to be careful a little bit, that some of the things I'm going to say about interpersonal comparisons, in fact, also apply to intrapersonal comparisons. Okay, for instance, when we talk about scale norming, but I'll come to that later. So, first question is, Koen, if you want to say something about respecting preferences, what does it mean to respect preferences in an intrapersonal comparison? Let us try to be a bit precise. So what does it mean? It means that if Iris prefers life situation A over life situation B, then well-being should be higher in life situation A than in life situation B. Okay, that's a requirement. That's a test if you want. Okay, so the question is, does our self-reported well-being data pass this test? Okay, I see a puzzled face. Perfect. We do not know that. So the only thing that we can do at a certain point is to assume that. And that's in the work with Mark and Erik, we have called the consistency assumption. That's an assumption that tells us something about the link between preferences, the preference relation, and the observed self-reported well-being data. And we can assume that they are connected to one another. Economists would say, Koen, what you're assuming is to say that your self-reported well-being data is a representation of the preference relation. It's a utility function. Okay? Perhaps more important than this technical point is, what do we know about the consistency assumption? Is in fact the consistency assumption, does it hold? There is not that much literature on that actually, and that will be one of my last points, is that I would encourage us to spend more time on that question. But there is one paper in the AER, Dan Benjamin, Ori Heffitz, and co-authors, and they are quite critical to that consistency assumption. In fact, they make a point to say, well, in fact, if you let people choose, right, between alternatives, they would choose the one that makes them more rich. But if you ask them in which one would you be more satisfied, then they're much less likely to choose the one in which they would be rich. Okay, so that tells us that perhaps this consistency assumption does not always hold. But to give the full, let's say, the maximal benefit of the doubt to the self-reported well-being approach, let's assume that it holds. And if it holds, of course, it's trivial that, let me come to that. Well, let me first say, I'll come to that on my next slide. I think that what the role the consistency assumption can play for in a discussion like this is that it can help us, if you want to do well-being analysis for policymaking, to think about what is what are good questions, right? And I think we should then aim for questions that are close to people's preferences and that perhaps can help us in the choice between affective questions and more evaluative questions. And here, that's why I'm going to refer mostly to these more evaluative questions, which I think is much easier to argue that they are reflecting individual preferences. This is a point that in fact was very nicely put by Amartya Sen in his 85 Commodities and Capabilities book, which I find that's an excellent book. That was perhaps the book that makes me stand here. Okay, so that's what he calls valuation neglect, talking about the welfarist literature pre the 80s. Okay. Of course, if you're willing to make this assumption, this consistency assumption, then yes, in an intrapersonal comparison, then yes, the well-being measure and the preferences are aligned. But of course, my motivation was not about intrapersonal comparisons. My motivation was about interpersonal comparisons, comparisons of you and me. And now it becomes more challenging because what does it mean to respect preferences in a comparison of you and me? And in the paper with Mark and Erik, we have put the same preference principle on the table as a requirement for respecting preferences in interpersonal comparisons. The idea here is, let's consider two individuals, because we need two individuals. It's an interpersonal comparison. They both have the same preferences. So they have the same view on the good life. And they both agree that life situation A is better. In that case, they have the same preferences, and they both agree that life situation A is better. Well, then well-being should be higher in A than in B. Otherwise, the argument is you go against their unanimous preferences, if you want. Question is, do standard self-reported well-being data align with this principle, right? And the answer is that they mostly are not. And here is an example, or that we cannot always be sure that they are. Let me phrase it like that. There's two situations, life situation A, life situation B. These are two indifference curves from this common preference relation. How do you can see that they can come from the same preference relation? They do not cross. Okay. Let's say that this is one person. This is Iris. And Iris, in fact, is in life situation A. She's sitting there. And Iris says, well, my life, that's a 5 life. Life B, that's clearly a worse life. That's a 3 life on a scale between 0 and 10. Then we ask John. John is there. John says, oh, my life is a 7 life. I have a great life, right? An A life situation A, that would be really great. That's a 9 for me. And if we now compare Iris in her life situation to John in his life situation, we see that Iris is a 5, 7 is a John. So against their commonly held preferences, that A is the better life compared to B. Still, we see that that self-reported well-being in life situation B by John is higher than the self-reported well-being reported by Iris in life situation A. And I think that's the key insight. Okay. What can be going on? Two things can be going on which are hard to empirically distinguish from one another, but which are conceptually a bit different. First thing is, and we have talked about that yesterday, would be, this is an example of Iris and John just using the scale in a different way. That's what Mark was talking about. And in fact, Mark would even argue that this could happen within Iris and within John over time. That's scale norming, right? Yeah. So this, but I mean, I think perhaps it's conceptually nice to distinguish them for a presentation like this. So that's one thing, and I will come to that more extensively also later. Another thing that could be going on is that Iris and John have adapted to their life situation in a different way. And that puts the very fundamental question on the table is adaptation. Is that something we would like to take into account as welfare economists who want to advise policymakers, yes or no? And again, I think Sen's 85 book has nice insights on that. With a nice, I think, quote that perhaps most of us know is that Sen argues, for instance, that adaptation should not be taken into account, what he calls physical condition neglect. So where are we in my story? The first use would be to say, yes, I use self-reported well-being because I'm a preferentialist. In intrapersonal comparisons, if you want to buy the consistency assumption, that's fine. in interpersonal comparisons, I don't think that that works well. Of course, this begs the question, yeah, Koen, it's very nice to be critical, right? But is there something? Is there an approach that is consistent with preferences, that we know will always be consistent with individual preferences? And here is one example, okay? One example would be to use equivalent incomes. And that's why we have this horrible acronym for our survey, because our survey was called Measuring Equivalent Income. MEKIN, but okay. Let Koen, a wise lesson, never try to explain a bad acronym. Okay, back to our blue person income and health. How do we measure equivalent incomes? What's the idea? The idea is very simple. The idea is you observe an indifference map of a person. What you're going to do is you're going to observe the shape of the indifference map. That's what you take from the person, but you're going to attach new labels to the indifference maps, to the indifference curves, in a way that you can argue, or that you think you can argue, are interpersonally comparable. One way to do that would be to say, I take a reference value for the non-monetary aspects. I believe that Tessa was talking about full health or perfect health, right here. And then how are we going to evaluate the situation of the blue person? We're going to do that by walking along her indifference curve until we reach that red reference. You're too kind. Too kind and reading my mind. Thanks, Francesco. So what we obtain here is this intersection, and that level of income, that's what we call the equivalent income. It's that income that, combined with the reference situation on all the non-monetary aspects, would make you equally good as your actual income. Okay? And the argument, and that's an ethical argument, you buy it or you don't buy it, it's a normative argument, is that these equivalent incomes, that those incomes can be compared across people. By the way, an equivalent income is nothing else than your actual income minus your willingness to pay for not being in the reference situation for the non-monetary dimensions. So the point is, these equivalent incomes, they can be compared across people. Okay? That's, I think, is what I have said. So this equivalent income is just one way of this broader approach that says, take the indifference maps of people and relabel them by an ethical argument. Okay, there's alternatives, but the equivalent income is I think quite nice, because why is it? One of the nice features it has is that it brings everything back to the income dimension. Everything is again expressed in monetary values, in euros, and if you're interested in inequality or poverty analysis, as I am, as I already have revealed, you can just put these equivalent incomes in your inequality measures, poverty measures, and so on. So for every person, take the observed income and subtract the willingness to pay. That raises a new question. And that new question is, yeah, Koen, but you need much more data. You need to know the indifference maps, the indifference curves of people. How do you think you're going to obtain that information? And that brings me to my second use of self-reported well-being for well-being analysis. So perhaps we can use our self-reported well-being data to learn something about the indifference maps. Taking one step back, for the economists in the room, I mean, we think that estimating preferences is, in fact, that's what we do, right? What are the tools that we have? If you would ask, say, standard economists, say, estimating preferences, that's revealed preferences. You look at the behavior of people, and then you perhaps know something about the constraint. From variations in the constraint, you can back out the preferences. That's the standard revealed preference approach. But for our purpose, that doesn't work. Why is that not working? Because the bundle in which you are is not a choice. I'm not choosing my health situation, right? Perhaps I'm choosing part of my behavior, my lifestyle, but my health is not a chosen variable. So behavior and choices, observed choices that we observe in actual data cannot help us very much, I believe, to elicit the kind of preferences that we are interested in. In other words, we are interested in non-market aspects. That's exactly why we are interested in including these other dimensions in our analysis. So what do we have as alternative is a stated preference approach. To say, well, you want to know the willingness to pay for not being in the reference situation? Well, go to people and ask it. So what is the standard you could think of the standard approach, would be contingent valuation. Okay, you want to know this willingness to pay, well, just ask it. That's what we have done in that survey. So let me tell you a little bit about the survey very roughly. So there's an income module, the consumption module, in fact, what I'm going to use here, that asks people their income or their consumption. Then there's a health module. For Tessa, it's the SF12. Right? It's a very short and very imperfect health measure, but that allows you to map your health situation on 5 dimensions. What we do is we show people on a screen a nice visualization of your income and 5 bars, your health. And we say, this is your situation, that's what you have just told us. Now we show people an alternative with a big question mark for your income, but you show the bars, the health bars at the max. You say, that's full health. What would be behind the question mark? What would be the income level such that what is behind the question mark combined with the full health bars brings you in a situation which is actually as good as your actual situation? What is behind the question mark? That's this equivalent income that I'm interested in. So that would be a very direct approach in asking that. I told you I have 3,400 observations. About half of them return a number, and the other half say the number is 0. Okay. We can do some fancy non-parametric estimates of how the indifference curves look like. This is for some groups, but after all the fancy econometrics, we were scratching our head, and this is not the first time that we find to do such a thing and that we find this result. I mean, Mark and Eric have found a similar result in France, for instance. And you say, but Koen, you can never go to policymakers with that. The willingness to pay that you have estimated with that method is extremely low. Okay. Why? What could be going on? Well, one of the things that could be going on is that people say, Koen, you're asking me to put a monetary price on my health. I just don't want to do that. This is a taboo question. We don't want to do that. Right? So, and I think that's why we had so many zeros here. Right? We try with follow-up questions to figure out whether these are really taboo zeros or real zeros, because if you are already in perfect health, your willingness to pay should be 0. So we try to figure that out a little bit, but I think that that is certainly one of the problems with this contingent valuation method. And I think you have noticed, right? I could also see from your faces, even explaining to a trained audience, right, the experts in the field, how you do the willingness to pay contingent valuation question is very hard. So this is very hard. Piloting has learned us that people really do not always understand the question in the way that we have intended. So these are very hard questions. Isn't there a simpler way of getting to this willingness to pay? And that's where self-reported well-being can come in the picture, right? And in fact, in my own research agenda, in my own research, I think I've written 5 or 6 papers using exactly this. Okay, saying, well, what we can do is we want to know this willingness to pay. Let's try to estimate it based on a self-reported well-being data. For people who are not aware of this technique, there's a very nice survey article by Andrew Oswald and Andrew Clark on how to do that, 2002, Journal of Epidemiology, I believe. What's the idea? The idea is in fact very simple. You have self-reported well-being, you have the 2 dimensions that you're interested in, you run a regression, you have coefficients, and that tells us if I play with this, how much I have to play with that to compensate for the same self-reported well-being. Okay, so that's the idea. Of course, if you want to do not have super simple linear indifference curves, you have to allow for non-linearities. Here we do that with a logarithm, but you can do much more sophisticated things, box-Cox transformations, whatever you want. And of course, you want to have preference heterogeneity, so you would want to interact this with social demographics, so that you have a bit of variation. Okay, let me skip that slide. But what is important to know is that this coefficient is very important. That's the income coefficient, because the income coefficient that will be appearing in the denominator of your willingness to pay. Okay? If we do that again with the same data, it's the same individuals, we have self-reported well-being, we have income, we have health, we estimate that. We even do that in the same parametric model. So this is the willingness to pay. Sorry, the red one is the one that I've already shown you, but now in that same parametric model, the very low willingness to pay, the person is here, so the willingness to pay is very low. But if we do it with self-reported well-being data, the willingness to pay is very high. So I have the mirror problem. my first estimate, I didn't believe because it was too low. My next estimate is basically saying people are willing to almost give up all their consumption for the health they have observed. We have very high perfect health, willingness to pay for perfect health. And I think, well, that's our appreciation of this result is that, in fact, what we have obtained is a result that we obtain consistently in different contexts, is that perhaps this income coefficient is quite small, right? Which would lead to indeed a very high willingness to pay. What could be going on? Why could the income coefficient in such a life satisfaction regression be too small? And again, I'm talking to the experts. You're much more the experts than I am. First reason could be, but Koen, this estimate only holds under the consistency assumption. And we have seen that the one paper that there is on the test of the consistency assumption tells you, well, people perhaps the consistency assumption does not hold, in particular when it deals with income comparisons. But that could be one reason. It could also be an endogeneity reason, and then you use instruments, and typically if you use instruments, this income coefficient would go up. But what I want to talk more about today, and I promise that I did not prepare that yesterday evening after Mark's presentation, right? I did it the day before on the train, right? Is I think that the reporting scale can be a contributor to that low estimate of the income coefficient and hence the high estimate of the willingness to pay. Let me say a little bit about that. Let me try to focus, and this is a discussion we had more or less yesterday. Let me try to do that in my naive and primitive way. So what is the important insight is that these self-reported well-being questions are self-reported, and they are reported on a scale, an ordered response scale typically. Smileys, 1 to 10, words, an ordered response scale. I tried to put it a bit in a model, right? So the idea is, these are the dimensions of life. This is your evaluation of life. That's the first step. You make an evaluation of life. This is your utility function, if you want. That's this evaluation function. But this is on a scale that is not a scale that is reported. To map that into the scale, the chosen response scale, you use R. That's the reporting function that Mark was so passionately talking about yesterday. Okay? I think that it perhaps is useful to call it like that. And now I have to tell you an anecdote. On Wednesday, when I was leaving to come to the conference, I have a 3-year-old boy. I was trying to explain my boy what I was coming to do. And I tell you, it's a conference. He looked at me. So I go to very clever people to explain them a story. And he looked at me and said, it's a story about dinosaurs? And I said, well, I talk about the C-Rex. So yes, here is a dinosaur for my boy. Okay, serious again. I thought that some people perhaps would be falling asleep, so a joke in between. So here is Iris and John, and this is basically a graph that already Mark has given yesterday. So imagine that Iris and John have to rate the quality of the sanitation in the airport with those smileys. Iris is there, John is there. Exactly same evaluation of the sanitation quality, right? But Iris uses this scale, John uses that scale, and exactly the same evaluation is rated in a different, leads to a different result. Okay? And I think what is the fundamental, where I think things can go wrong for me, making this use of self-reported well-being data, is when the reporting function is not just noise, it's not just unsystematic noise, because then the error term can take care of that. No, it is when it is systematic. And in fact, the reporting function depends on these same X variables, because then I'm in deep trouble. Because the excess, the variation in the excess, let's say the variation in income, affects the evaluation. That's what I'm interested in. But it also may affect the reporting function, right? And then I have an unsolvable identification problem, which I think is really potentially very, very dramatic for this use of self-reported well-being data. How can we try to think about that? That's a very hard question, right? Because now we have to disentangle two things which happen within a head of a person. This cognitive process, we have to disentangle it. One way to do that would be to say, let's fix the blue thing, and then we observe variation in the axis, and then we can attribute that to the reporting function. That's an identifying assumption. And you know, when you say identifying assumptions, the people in the audience are trained to say, I don't believe your identifying assumption. Okay, that's what we do in our profession. But I think this is really important to think about carefully, how can we identify this reporting function? One way to do that would be, again, with vignettes. The identifying assumption is the vignette equivalence assumption. Very beautiful paper by Gary King and co-authors in the American Political Science Review, 2004, I believe, that really spells this out very carefully. Going back to the making data, we have in fact 3 vignettes. So let me show you some results. We have vignettes, a low vignette, a medium vignette, and a high vignette. And this is how these vignettes have been rated by people in our sample. I rank them by income level. So these are poor people, these are rich people, and this is how they rate the low vignette, the middle vignette, and the high vignette. And what do we see? Richer people give systematically a lower evaluation to the same vignette. This is at least suggestive evidence that this reporting function is not just heterogeneous across people, but it is also systematically heterogeneous across people. You can say, yeah, Koen, but this identifying assumption, this is super hypothetical. It's a vignette, it's a hypothetical bias. Okay, let's try another. So this is work with Matteo, my other PhD student. You say, well, let's not rely on hypothetical evaluations, but real evaluations, real world evaluations. And we were thinking, we had a long brainstorming session, what is a setting in which we have data, that we have some grasp on the systematic variation in the data of the same evaluations of the same item. And the idea we came up with is to web scrape the booking.com evaluations. The idea is very simple. We all have made a booking.com reservation. The night you're back, the next morning you get an email from them, evaluate your stay. That's the data that we use. So if you're asked tomorrow morning, please do that, you contribute to science. This is your evaluation of your room. What we actually observe is the room in which you were. We know the hotel and we know the type of the room. So perhaps we have all been in the same room, basically. The same room type in the same hotel. We identify with room dummies the rooms, and then we know the country of origin of the evaluator. And we are interested in that. And this addresses a question that was raised yesterday by somebody about the cross-country heterogeneity in the reporting function for this question. And then there is some other trip characteristics, but we don't care about that. This is the heterogeneity. These are the betas for different countries. So this is, you stay in a room, what is the systematic variation with the country? In other words, if you are a hotel owner, who are the people that you have to push to rate your room? People from Latin America. They gave darker is a more optimistic evaluation of the room. People from Latin America rate the same room systematically more optimistic than people from the Middle East, for instance. What we then thought to do was to say, well, let's now go to the World Happiness Report, because very kindly there is the regression, the macro regression can be replicated. So this is for the countries for which we have estimated this response style variable, if you want. This is our replication of their main regression of the country level variation of self-reported life satisfaction, and compare this column with that column. The only thing we have changed is we add our hotel room estimate of the reporting function, of the generosity of the reporting function. And you see it's highly significant. So more generous rating of a hotel room also leads to higher subjective well-being in the World Happiness Report. What is the most important finding here for me is that look at the income coefficient. It's a macro income coefficient. So my point was micro, but I think it's suggestive evidence that look here, the income coefficient goes up. So what do I think that is going on is that in a life satisfaction regression, we observe a net effect of your effect on self-reported well-being, the effect in the E, which is positive, and a negative effect in the reporting function. So we observe the net effect, and in fact, we are only interested in that. And that's why the income coefficient is too small and the willingness to pay is too high. So can we estimate willingness to pay without relying on a reporting function. Let me have 5 more minutes, right? Yeah. So let me present an alternative. And this is a paper that I have written with Annemie Nijs in the European Economic Review 2 years ago, in which we propose an adaptive bisectional dichotomous choice method. The idea is, again, same story, and even here I allow for incomplete preferences. So that means that the indifference curve is thick. There is an area here between these two lines in which people say, well, is it better? Is it worse? Honestly, Koen, you can torture me, but I do not know. Okay, I mean, this is just too hard for me. This is an incomplete preference, which I think the method can quite naturally accommodate, which can be potentially for some people very large. I have colleagues, I mean, I'm in a sociology department, when I present this, who say, come on, Koen, who believes that anybody can answer a question like that? It's way too fundamental. For them, this non-comparable set here would be much larger. How does this ABDC, Adaptive Bisectional Choice method work? It works as follows. So the person is here. Low health, that's the income. And now we are going to ask that person to compare her own situation with an alternative hypothetical situation. That hypothetical situation is a situation in which your health is perfect and your income is the half of your actual income. And you're asking, now, Mrs. Blue, is your actual blue situation better or worse than your red situation? Now, with those indifference maps, we know that she's going to prefer the red one, right? This gives me a nice insight about where this intersection is, because remember, that's what I'm interested in. I want to know this. Where is the intersection between this indifference curve and this line? I know if the red point is preferred, that the intersection is somewhere here. It cannot be there, because that one is better, if preferences are assumed to be transitive and monotone along that, in that direction. If that's the case, and if I'm doing an online survey, I can ask a next question. Because I know it is somewhere here, I can ask again halfway. That's my next step, is to say, well, can I ask you also the blue dot and the new red dot? And now the new red dot is in the worse than set. So the person is going to say, no, Koen, give me the blue dot, my own situation. Now I know that the intersection is here, and I can continue. Right? I can continue. Again, I halve, and I ask this new red dot. And this red dot is preferred, so I know it is there. And I can continue until I end there, and the person says, come on, stop this. I don't know. Okay? And that's basically what we do. That's what we do in the adaptive bisectional dichotomous choice method. And you see, there is no relying on a reporting function whatsoever. It's just ordinal information that people provide us, which is better. The unfortunate thing is that the ABDC is, in fact, originated as our own critique on what we have seen in the making data. So I cannot run it on the same data set, but we have collected new data with the list panel. The list panel is a Dutch representative panel, right? Whatever the word representative may mean after yesterday, right? A representative panel, and we have done that 2 years ago, and we think about 3 dimensions. It's very much inspired by COVID, income, health, and social relations. Life satisfaction is available in the main panel of lists, and in fact also an income module, a health module, and a social relations module. So we don't have to ask that, we know that. We can show immediately this nice summary screen to people. We have bought 2,000 respondents, and some of them are exposed only to the ABDC, others to the ABDC afterwards with a contingent valuation. I'm not going to use that, but there's a control group in which we first ask the contingent valuation and then the ABDC. So I'm going to compare this group with that group. Okay. This is how a screenshot looks like. So this is the first question, if you want. That's what people have told me. That's what I know from them. They have been given the option to correct that. So you might say, but health might have changed in the meanwhile. Then people are able to correct that, go through the questionnaire again, and then the new figure arises. And what people choose is either this one or that one, or I don't know. People who have read the Bernheim papers on incomplete preferences might recognize the formulation. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A session. This is the responses, right? You see that there is quite some people responding, I don't know, and they every time fall from that, then it stops for them. Okay? This is the results. So this is the equivalent, this is the income distribution. It's a box plot of the income distribution. This is the equivalent income distribution with the ABDC method. So what do? Is we have subtracted the willingness to pay for not being in perfect health, not having the best social relations according to you. And you see the willingness to pay is more or less the difference between the purple and the reddish box plot. This is the same results for life satisfaction. Yes, willingness to pay is way too high. The resulting equivalent incomes are, I'm not going to say unreasonably low, but are very low. If you do the contingent valuation, small group, you have seen the groups are unevenly spread. So this is small, less precisely estimated, but you see that the willingness to pay, the difference between the purple and the yellowish is quite small. That's what we obtain here. And hence the equivalent incomes are very close to the actual incomes of people. Okay. Another way of saying the same thing. So this is the percentage, sorry for the axis that has been dropped, is the percentage of your income you're willing to give up for not being in the perfect situation. Okay. According to the ABDC, we see, if you want a small grade, a U, it's flat or a U shape, depends on how you want to look at things. But I think the more important information is the overall level. That's the ABDC. That's the life satisfaction. Very high willingness to pay. Contingent valuation, very low willingness to pay. So, concluding, what have we learned, if you want? These were my two uses that I had in mind of self-reported well-being data to make these comparisons. Intrapersonal, fine, under the consistency assumption. Interpersonal, well, scale use and adaptation issues are issues we have to face. There's an alternative, equivalent incomes, if you want to use that. Scale use problem, I think, is quite pervasive in the second use as well, when you want to estimate the willingness to pay. Ordinal information from your self-reported well-being data. Here again is an alternative. And now you might say, but Koen, can't we be a bit more, is there really nothing? And I think there is, right? But one use you can make of self-reported data would be to say, well, Koen, it's not the data that I'm used to infer something about the evaluation, it's an extra dimension. It's a dimension of life. Feelings, emotions, affects, perhaps even an evaluation, could be a dimension of life. And then you are in situations where you ask people, for instance, to compare being happy and poor with being unhappy and rich. There's a JBO paper, Paul Dolan, Matthew Adler, and co-authors have done exactly that. That's one way in which you could say, well, that's how I use my self-reported well-being data in this preferentialist approach. And then the other line would be to say, Koen, I've listened an hour to you, and the only thing I've learned is I'm not a preferentialist at all. I am a self-reported well-being person, and in fact, that's perfectly valid, right? Because I think that philosophers make a distinction between three accounts of well-being. First of all is the philosopher king, the objective account. That was my account, the preferentialist account. And you might say, no, I am in this group. And I was an entertaining presentation, perhaps, but I am here. And this was only relevant for there. If that is your position, then my last slide would be an invitation for, as a welfare economist, to a self-reported well-being group. I think there's two questions that you could really help us with to address them together, right? Would be to investigate carefully the consistency assumption, because that is quite key, and we have not enough insights on that. And I'm echoing here Mark's presentation, and Casper's final sentence in one of his recent papers is the reporting function. I really believe that we have to work together on that and to gather deeper insights in the systematic variation in the reporting function. And that's what I wanted to say.
So we have a little less than 10 minutes, so I think we should collect some questions. Is this working? Yeah, okay.
So thank you very much for your presentation. It was very illuminating. I want to address this last point because I was recalling Kahneman's article on the experience utility versus the choice utility. And what he claims is that we act differently when we have to make a choice and when we experience the choice we've made. So I'm more into the subjective well-being approach, saying that I want to know what people experience and how they feel. And I'm not that convinced that we have a problem with the reporting function. What my idea is that if we could devise or imagine a machine that could read our minds and read perfectly our state of mind, then we would eliminate this reporting function. And I'm guessing that the results would not be very different from what we get from surveys. So I would like some comments on that.
Thanks, great presentation. Obviously, we have a lot of similar interests. I have so many questions, but I guess one, it's not an easy question, but what do you think the sort of reasonable limits are of where we can and need to get a number on these kind of things? So there's a lot of stuff that we care about for well-being that's just fundamentally not a quantity and is indivisible. So I'm thinking of things like love or democracy, these kind of things. And maybe we don't need to put numbers on these things to make policy decisions about them. And then there's other cases, and I think Tessa's talk yesterday was really good on this, like in healthcare, we often really, really do need to put some numbers on stuff. And there's some cases where those numbers are really informative, like knee reconstructions, and then others where they're not so informative, like a lot of chronic problems. So yeah, I'm wondering what you think the limits of where we really need numbers and where we don't.
One more question and then another round.
Well, this might be the same as the first question, but I'll phrase it differently. Do you think it's possible for there to be a world, a society in which there are systematic biases in what people believe about their experience well-being versus reality? Or separately, that people's behaviors are systematically biased away from the best outcomes for them. So could there be something that is really important about society that creates that wedge, and does that impact your work?
I have one or two more questions, but maybe you can respond now.
And I'll try to be brief because these are such broad questions. Can beliefs be systematically biased? That, I think, is a very interesting question. Just one comment on that is, I think there's one thing in empirically estimating the reporting function. There would be another research agenda, which I would be very interested in, is to think about where does the reporting function and the biases come from? What's the theoretical constructs? And I think that one of them might be education. How do we learn how response scales are used? We learn that in primary school when we are receiving our first graded assignment, right? And some teachers in some cultures, right? So I think I see this reporting styles as a culture, as an outcome, as an economist, as an outcome to a coordination game, right? We have to communicate about something. There is in fact nothing in the real world that tells us what a 7 is or what a 10 is. So we form that as a culture, right? And how do we communicate? How do we ingrain this culture in the next generation? That's by grading, for instance. So I think I can live in a world where perhaps there is that the systematic biases are cultural differences in how real world phenomena are mapped into numerical or ordered scales. And I think that this educational mechanism could contribute to transmitting that across people. I don't know whether that's answering the existential question whether biases can exist. One number or not, I don't think that we should try to put a number on love. Otherwise, yeah, okay, let's not finish my sentence. But I think that we should not be naive. Policymakers have to make choices. policymakers have to make choices that involve trade-offs across different dimensions of life. Think of the lockdown. That was essentially a trade-off between income, health, and social relations. And if they have to make these trade-offs, we can as well try to inform them. So I don't think that we have to put numbers on everything, but on the things that the policymakers are making choices about, we better do that because they do that implicitly. And then the experience versus choice view or utility. I think that, as you have perfectly formulated yourself, I think that deep down you're not a preferentialist, and deep down I am a preferentialist, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, but what we have to be clear about is that I suffer several problems because I don't capture this experienced utility aspect, but your problem is that you at a certain point will face paternalism, that you are going to do well-being analysis that might go against the preferences of people. And you might say, Koen, I don't care about the preference of people. That's exactly because you're not a preferentialist. Okay, that's perfectly fine. That's a different normative view on well-being. And that's why I started by saying we have to be very clear and precise on that in an exchange like this. I wrote reporting, but I forgot your question, but I suggest that we talk about that during the break.
Thank you. This was super helpful and clarifying. One thing that I didn't understand was, suppose you're a benevolent dictator and you want to do the most good. And you're either a preferentialist or a hedonist, but you use the same data. You use, let's say, a life satisfaction question. It seems to me that if you then want to maximize the amount of goodness you do, the results that you're getting should be the same, no matter whether you're a preferentialist or a hedonist. Could you maybe try and clarify where my mistake comes from?
Sorry for doing this, but I think that my initial example will perhaps clarify. Allez. I'm already too far? No. Where is, here. So I think this is an example where it would be different. I have this. This is my scarce resources, and I give it either to Iris or to John. I'm going to give it to John. Because they both agree that he's worse off. The hedonist is going to give it to Iris, because she has the lowest self-reported well-being. That's where we disagree, and where the hedonist would say, give it to, sorry, perhaps this is more informative, give it to the lowest, the person who reports the lowest self-reported well-being, that's Iris. But Iris is in the preferred situation. So as a preferentialist, the unique policy instrument should go to John.
And if you're at average maximizing or total maximizing hedonist, it shouldn't matter whether you give it to Iris or John, right?
Sure. I mean, if you're average, yes, but as an average maximizer, you would not. It wouldn't matter either where to give this. So the question, I think, would not arise for a maximizing. So it's for a Rawlsian or for somebody who has an epsilon concern about the worse off. Then the question arises, of course, who is the worse off? Otherwise, you can just throw it in the society and give it to Bill Gates. It doesn't matter for the average.
I think that's a great place to end.
Yes, to give things to Bill Gates.
It's a good fit. Thank you very much.